All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you tuning in on the live stream, my name is John Hudak. I'm the Director of Maine's Office of Cannabis Policy. This is the fourth and likely final meeting of the Cannabis Hospitality Task Force, which is a legislatively directed effort pursuant to Public Law 2023, Chapter 679, or LD 40. Our meetings and discussions will result in a report to the legislature with the task force's findings and recommendations. I want to thank this group for having 3 really productive sessions so far. And what I'm looking forward to is a fourth, also productive session today. We'll talk a little bit toward the end of the meeting about some next steps as well. There's some homework assignments for everyone. We'll have more information that will get distributed to the group after this meeting, in part as a result of conversations we're having with other agencies or other external stakeholders, and in part from the homework assignments that I'm going to assign. We have one benefit for the group. You're going to hear a lot less from me today because we have some task force members who are going to be presenting on specific topics. We have an external individual presenting as well, but we do have a lot to cover today. We may run a little late. You guys have made my life easier. I talked to Alexi about this today in terms of being able to keep everyone on schedule. And so I'd like to be out of here by 4 o'clock today, but in case we do have to run a couple of minutes over, obviously feel free to jump when you need to jump. But I'm expecting us to be out by 4. A few quick housekeeping reminders, and then we'll jump in. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed. The video will be linked after the meeting on OCP's Cannabis Hospitality Task Force webpage. So please know that anything shared here today will be public record. We ask that you please keep comments and questions focused on the issues we're here to discuss and to respect one another. I'm grateful that that has in particular not been a problem with this group. And for those of you online, please remember to use the raised hand emoji in Zoom's reaction function. Use the chat and/or physically raise your hand on video so we can see it and make sure we get to your comments. So to start us off today, I'd like to introduce Scott Rutledge, who is joining us remotely. He's a government and regulatory affairs specialist and nonprofit management professional based in Las Vegas. Scott's efforts as a lead lobbyist on the 2021 Nevada law that established cannabis lounges and his work with local jurisdictions to implement lounge ordinances has established him as a leading voice on social use policy. I've worked with Scott on a variety of topics and panels, sat on panels with him over the years. A top-notch professional, one of the most thoughtful and knowledgeable individuals about social consumption lounge policy in the country. And so we're pleased to have him here today. And so, Scott, I'm just going to hand it over to you. Scott's going to provide a presentation, and then there will be time after his presentation for some Q&A. Scott, thanks for joining us today, a little earlier in the Pacific time zone than we are in Augusta, Maine, but thanks for joining.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, Director Hudak, to the members of the board. I appreciate you inviting me to come and speak about a policy in an area of regulation that I've spent a great deal of time working on here in Nevada. By further way of introduction, I am the co-founder of a company called Reset, which is focused on cannabis hospitality. My partner, Christopher Laporte, is the operations member of our team, and I am the policy and regulatory member. We are currently working with 3 clients here in the state of Nevada on opening up their cannabis lounges. We had a 4th client that we worked with. We actually were consultants and advisors to opening up Smoke and Mirrors, which was the first state licensed cannabis consumption lounge opened in Nevada back earlier this year. And what I'm hoping to share with the committee today is basically just some things that we've learned, lessons learned, going from legislation to regulation, and of course, working with local jurisdictions on ordinances to opening. What I would start with saying is that I think it's really important as you're discussing this potential policy with policymakers, as regulators, as you think about what is going to come to you if a bill is in fact passed. And then for those in the industry or would like to get into the industry and participate in this type of cannabis business, just some things that we've learned along the way. And probably the most important thing is flexibility. And what I mean by that is we worked closely in 2021. I was then in my former life representing the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, or Chamber of Cannabis here in Nevada. And we worked very closely with our state regulators during the process of policymaking. And the bill sponsor was very open to the suggestions, and primarily where we found the flexibility was most important was we didn't put everything in statute that you might expect in a bill like this, because we wanted the regulations to allow for ultimate flexibility. It's much easier, as you probably know, to go in and amend a regulation or receive the type of input around regulations than oftentimes it is with policy making, and not having to go back and re-legislate something. So why flexibility? Because we wanted these new business license types to be successful businesses, right? What's different about cannabis hospitality compared to every other type of cannabis license is that it's truly the only type of license where you are selling and serving and then observing the consumption of cannabis on site. So it's a different ball game than selling cannabis at a retail location. It also provides for a lot of interesting opportunities. If you think about it, most people, when they think about drinking alcohol, they're doing on-site or on-premise consumption, right? You're going to a bar, a restaurant, a ball game, right? You certainly buy alcohol from a package store or a grocery store, what have you, but a lot of people, when they think about consuming alcohol, it's generally in public at an on-site consumption space. And so for cannabis to achieve the same type of what we call normalcy, right? We wanted to allow these businesses to have the type of flexibility when it comes to different business models. So I think the term lounge is a misnomer, because cannabis lounge might mean one thing to one person and one thing to another. But I think most people, when you say lounge, they think of like a cigar lounge or a cocktail lounge. But a cannabis hospitality license, in our mind, should allow for the type of flexibility. If you would like to open up a restaurant, if you'd like to open up a comedy club, I think if you wanted to do any kind of business where you would go and you would consume alcohol, we were trying to apply that same way of thinking towards cannabis. So when we created the law, we did create a new category of cannabis type or cannabis production, and it was called ready to consume. Ready to consume is in some ways the ultimate flexibility around cannabis products, because it would allow these venues to receive cannabis products that could then be converted into a new product on site. And one of probably the most interesting examples of this, and something I'd like to share a little bit of data on, is that cannabis beverages, right, are a fast-growing segment of the cannabis marketplace and the hemp-derived marketplace, right? We're reading a lot about these beverages being consumed all over. So for the marijuana-based state licensed cannabis licenses, to allow you to produce essentially like a mixology program on site was something that we had envisioned. We also thought it would be a way for cannabis consumers who don't particularly like to smoke cannabis, but consuming an edible on site didn't necessarily make sense either because of the onset period, et cetera, right? It doesn't make sense to go into a venue, consume a cannabis edible, and not feel the effects until potentially 2 hours later after you've left the venue. What we found with cannabis beverages is there was a pretty fast-acting onset for a lot of these types of beverages. And the other thing you have to think about, if you're trying to attract consumers to cannabis lounges, if that's what you choose to call them, or these venues, a lot of people who aren't consuming cannabis on a regular basis might not be interested in smoking or vaping or dabbing, right? And as we've already discussed, edibles don't necessarily make sense in these venues. They could in certain ways, but so cannabis beverages, right? What's more social than drinking? When we were opening up Smoke and Mirrors, we had made an estimate that we thought, based on how we marketed the business upon opening, was that it would have about 50% sales in cannabis beverages and the other 50% would be in flowers, dabs, et cetera. Turns out 70% of our sales were beverages. And what we found from consumers coming into the business was that they were not interested in smoking flower, or they hadn't done so in such a long time. But to sell them a low dose cannabis beverage, and when I say low dose, we started at 2.5 milligrams per beverage, and we have a limit in regulation of 10 milligrams. I think you could probably even go lower depending on folks' sensitivity. And I think there's nothing in the regulations that says you have to sell a minimum of, right? But we did want to make sure that there was at least a minimum offering of 2.5 milligrams. And what that, for someone who has a, let's just say, not a extreme THC sensitivity, that might mean consuming 2 beverages over the course of an hour while in the venue. We also found that people that like to smoke flower were also purchasing beverages, which was really interesting because we weren't sure how somebody who was coming in, maybe a legacy consumer who prefers just to smoke cannabis, would respond to the beverage program, but they got really high marks. So I think that's part of that flexibility we were looking for in legislation and in regulation put into actual practice in a business setting. And again, 70% of our sales were cannabis beverages during those first 90 days. So I do think, when you think about other types of offerings, focusing on low dose, especially for any sort of edible product, whether it be a beverage or if you're going to infuse something, or if you're going to offer some sort of like a snack or something like that could potentially have an infusion, keeping that dose really low for the consumer is going to be important. When it comes to smoking or dabbing, one of the big conversation points during the regulatory process, because for some reason it wasn't discussed as much during the legislative process. I assume it was because most legislators thought that this would be more of a local decision over a state policy decision, and that was, what do we do about indoor air quality? And so during the regulatory process, we did come up with some standards for how many air exchanges an hour, et cetera. But one of the things that we started to realize over the course of the few months we were working on this specific part of the policy was that to build an indoor air quality system to do, say, for example, 20 air exchanges an hour was going to be prohibitively expensive for a lot of these venues. So we included some language that allowed for a waiver that would have to be approved by our Cannabis Compliance Board. And in fact, Smoke and Mirrors did open up with such a waiver. And so as opposed to 20 air exchanges an hour, we were able to bring in a filtration system that, as opposed to bringing in fresh air and pushing out the other air, it was filtering it through these carbon filters. Now, I'm not an expert on HVAC or air quality, but I can tell you that there are companies out there today that produce these products for cigar lounges here in Las Vegas, casinos, et cetera. And so as you're contemplating how to create a business-friendly policy and or the regulations, think about some of the other alternatives to that requirement for those air exchanges, because there are ways to create a healthy indoor air environment without causing a company to spend, say, $500,000 on an indoor air quality system. A couple other things that we learned, the guest experience, what's really important about a cannabis venue is, and we believe this from our company Reset and how we approached our consulting with our clients, is it's got to be hospitality first. And the reason we say that is because the novelty of consuming cannabis in public may not be as novel as some folks think. And what I mean by that is whether you go to a concert or any sort of event, right? I mean, we've had cannabis consumption events for as long as I can remember, because everybody, it seems, has seen somebody or they themselves partake in consuming cannabis at a concert, right? So it's more about the experience. People are going, they're wanting to see their favorite band play, and they were bringing their cannabis with them. So if you gave somebody a space where all that was allowed in law or regulation was a safe consumption site, as it were, without allowing that business to provide entertainment or food and beverage, you're not really giving the consumer a reason to show up. I mean, some people might like that idea of the same way that some people want to go to a bar to drink, but we knew that we needed to do more around the hospitality. That's what would be the driver. And so that's, of course, a business decision, but we would say from a policymaking and regulatory making position, allow these businesses to have that flexibility. Food and beverage, I'll also want to point to, we toured some of the venues in California, Colorado. And over the course of the last 5 years, and one of the things that we thought was challenging and why we allowed for this in the Nevada statutes and regulations was that if you didn't give people the ability to purchase food and beverage at one of these venues or to have any sort of food and beverage they could bring in, then you're really just asking people to come into a venue, consume cannabis, and leave. We would kind of call this the airport smoking lounge model, and we didn't think that was a very attractive business model. And if you're allowing people to bring food and beverage in, or say, for example, order something and have it delivered to them, now you've lost a revenue stream as a business. So as a business, we thought it was really important to create multiple revenue streams for these venues. So in addition to cannabis sales, you have F&B. If there's entertainment, you could have ticketing for the events, right? There could also be the potential for purchasing merchandise, et cetera. But we did not want to limit sales to just cannabis products. And that is a little different than what you see in, say, for example, a cannabis retail store, where you're not allowed to necessarily purchase non-cannabis items, except for potentially accessories. So allowing these businesses to have food and beverage sales, we think, is really important. Those are sort of the highlights of what I would like to focus on when I think about what makes a successful business model. I would like to go back one more time to the hospitality piece, right? So you don't want to walk into a business and the first thing is to feel like this whole thing's been over-regulated, or that there's a watchful eye on you the entire time, right? If you think about going into a bar or restaurant, someone comes in, they take your order, they bring you your alcohol, your food, you're consuming it, they check in, how are you doing? We did insist that, management come by and do table touches at our venues, because we thought it was just another way for us to, one, observe how the customer experience was going. And of course, always with a keen eye on overconsumption, which was a big conversation during our policymaking process and during the regulatory process. And, a couple ways to sort of work on the potential for overconsumption. Again, low dose products, even having low THC flower strains available. We have a lot of consumers that would come in and purchase, an 8 or 9% flower strain because they hadn't smoked in a while, right? And if that person's coming in and all they've got available to them are high potency strains, you could have a challenge. Something we did do that I think we probably shouldn't have done, is we said in statute that you could not take cannabis products from the venue when you leave. And the reason we thought you should be able to is, let's say that you're there with a couple of friends and you purchase an eighth of flower to consume, but you only end up smoking 1 gram of that. So we're asking the guests to leave the 2.5 grams behind, right? And so we didn't think that was a good idea. It does really force a lot of the sales to be single serving items at that point. And that is the case in most of the venues in Nevada. But if you're talking about a venue where someone's buying flower, loose flower, and they're going to roll it themselves or use devices, allowing them to take that with them when they leave, we think is an important component. Again, it's not necessarily been a restriction on business, but again, it's hard to say if that's true or not, because we don't know how many consumers would opt to buy maybe an eighth versus a gram, knowing that they can take the rest home with them if they don't finish it. So the idea of like buying a bottle of wine at dinner, not finishing your bottle of wine, and then taking it home with you. So, but again, I leave that conversation up to those who in your state that want to have that conversation. I think that's, for the most part, it. I'd be happy to entertain some questions from the committee. If there's anything I didn't cover, Director Hudak, that we discussed previously that I'm spacing on, please let me know. But I'm more than happy to discuss some of the things that were brought up today.
Well, that was great, Scott. Let's jump into questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. One of the questions I have is just, you mentioned air exchanges, obviously, as being one of the things that has required a waiver since then. Were there things during either the legislative development process or the rule development process that felt like really big issues at the time that have turned out to be nothing burgers, for lack of a better term?
No, that's a great question. So what I would say is, and we worked very closely with law enforcement in the development of this. And they did not oppose our legislation, and in fact, were neutral, but also helpful in having conversations behind the scenes with certain members of the legislature. And the thinking was people are going to consume, and then they're going to get in their cars and they're going to drive, and it's going to create a whole public safety issue. Now, our initial argument was people have been consuming cannabis before we legalized it, and then of course once we legalized it, and we have not seen an uptick in cannabis DUIs in Nevada since we legalized it and had first legal sales July of 2017. So there was an issue of, well, now people though are going out and they're treating it a little more loose, like going to a bar and you're going to have a couple drinks. But we have not seen any issues with cannabis consumption and then people leaving and accidents occurring. Now, part of that is because one, Las Vegas is a heavy tourism state, as you all know, and the venues that are open right now are adjacent to our tourism corridor. So you have a lot of folks showing up in cabs, rideshare, et cetera. Right. So that would explain for part of it. We also did notice in Smoke and Mirrors, we'd have groups come in where somebody chose not to consume. They were the designated driver, if you will, in a group. And so that person was not consuming. But even those folks that are coming in to consume, as we know, especially with medical programs that have stood up, that some people have a very high tolerance for cannabis. And so their ability to consume safely is, they're going to have a higher tolerance. We just haven't seen that issue play out in terms of a public safety concern, but it is important for these businesses to provide alternatives, whether it be a rideshare program, no-tow policies. If you need to leave your car overnight because you've overconsumed and you need to take a cab or a ride home and come back and pick up your car the next day. That also is more of a local issue, and it was not a state policy. So in like Clark County, which is where most of you know that Las Vegas Strip exists, that is part of the ordinance. We have a 24-hour no-tow policy at these venues. So you want to provide businesses the flexibility to have these types of programs, but it was not an issue that we have seen arise so far, but arguably we've only opened up 2 venues. So it's something we're going to continue to monitor closely.
This, and refresh my memory because we may have already talked about this, but did you open them up where there's alcohol and cannabis, or and if you didn't, what was the reason behind not having the 2 items together? And if you did, what was the reason behind having them together?
That's also a great question, and in fact was a topic of conversation early on. No, we do not allow the sale and consumption of alcohol on premise. You can't bring it with you and you can't purchase it there. That was also part of the agreement we had with law enforcement when we worked on the legislation. We did not proactively allow for alcohol. So I would say as a starting point, I would not combine the 2. And the main reason being, and again, this might be more specific to Las Vegas, but when you talk about polysubstance consumption, right? If you've been out drinking and then you come to our venue, that's another thing we actually talk to our guests about when they're coming in. Hey, what have you guys been up to today? And if someone looks visibly impaired from alcohol or potentially something else, we can refuse to serve them, right? Because we don't want a cross-fading scenario to occur. I do envision a scenario in the future where you would be able to purchase alcohol and cannabis side by side. But I think that is almost more of like when you go to a bar today with friends and one of your friends doesn't drink, but they consume cannabis, they're usually going out to the parking lot or the sidewalk or somewhere. They're going to smoke, and then they're going to come in and join you. They're just not drinking alcohol, right? In the same way, we have had people come into our venue with their friends who wanted to consume cannabis and had the expectation that alcohol sales would be there, and they were not. But we did actually offer a non-alcoholic beer program, and we can also make all of our cocktails without THC. And so that was something that I think is also important about having a food and beverage program or allowing non-cannabis sales. If you have people that are in your venue and are not consuming cannabis, they should have something to consume besides water. So I think that's, I would definitely take a very slow approach to combining the 2. I do think, again, in the future, once we have more data, that's something to consider, but I would not begin a process with allowing those to be sold side by side.
Sam?
I was going to say, can I add?
Yeah. Please.
Sorry. So with that being said, you said you have the right to refuse how did you go about designing your training program for your folks and your staff in those venues to make sure that, because maybe they didn't come, I mean, we have a lot of people that don't drink, as you mentioned, that we might hire that are only a cannabis consumer. They've never been trained in alcohol liquor sales to refuse or to watch for what signs. How did you go about incorporating the training for your staff?
So while there's not a standardized state training for these types of businesses, a lot of the training and education of the staff was borrowed from these safe alcohol programs. State Sell Smart and I think Serve Smart, which we've also seen some of that translated over into like cannabis retail sales when someone's coming in, hey, what should I buy? I'm a new consumer, and again, trying to direct them to products that aren't going to overwhelm them. It's the same in a venue like that, where you're looking and look, identifying certain, you know, I guess, behaviors, or let's just say how someone's behaving, is really just kind of up to that, you know, individual server and management. I can tell you that there weren't very many instances when we opened Smoke and Mirrors of having folks come in who we could not serve, right? And I think it was also because part of what you hope to do, and as a business, and I think it's twofold. It's what these businesses should do, but I also think it's about how the regulators and local jurisdictions also work with the media in educating the public about, hey, this business is going to open. Here's what's allowed. Here's what's not allowed. We did a lot of earned media in the roll up to opening Smoke and Mirrors. And I couldn't tell you how many news stories were done locally, but there had to have been at least 36 over the course of several months. And that also ties back to when the process of the bill being created and the regs. And so we believe there was a lot of like public education occurring just through earned media. But it's also important as a business, when you put up your website or as the guests come in, we have a host that before you come into the venue greets you, checks you in, scans your ID, similar like you would do in a retail experience. And there are certain policies and whatnot that you ask the guests to sign off on. So it's a lot of upfront education, right? And again, you don't want the guests to feel like you don't want them there, right? You can't make them feel like they're walking into a sandbox with a ton of rules that we're keeping an eye on you. But it's more about, hey, look, this is a new thing. We want you to have a great time. Here are the rules. And that touch at the host level, when they're being seated, whoever's seating them is obviously, you know, if you smell a bunch of alcohol on them. So they're just sort of basic things that you can build off of, that you don't have to be intrusive, right? But again, you need to be able to refuse sales if somebody is under the influence of something else, because you just don't want to deal with that situation in your on site, especially if someone's going to get sick. You know, it's just not something you want to have to deal with cleaning up, et cetera. So.
All right, Sam, and then I have the other Scott with one T.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies if there's any construction sounds in my background. I closed my window, so hopefully those stay off. And so Scott, thank you so much for being here. This has all been really helpful. Great to know about your focus on beverage program. And I had a couple of questions regarding that. First off, I know you mentioned that you make your own cannabis cocktails there. Do you offer canned or prepackaged items as well, or is it all you know, made to order cocktail style? And then my second question, we've had a lot of discussion about, you know, delayed onset with edibles and that being a consideration. I know there are products out there with the nano emulsification that are supposed to be more fast acting. What's your approach to that? Do you exclusively do things that are designed to be fast acting? Do you offer both? And if they are fast acting, just what are the products, like a syrup that you're mixing into the cocktails? Just know a lot about the policy, not as much about the operations of making the drinks.
No, that's a great question. Both of those, in fact. And I will qualify this with, you know, I am not an expert in cannabis extraction and the technologies. We were using a nano emulsified, it was a THC liquid. And basically it was almost, you know, not quite like a syrup, but definitely similar in consistency. This was actually pre-dosed in 2.5 milligram syringes that were then added to each cocktail. The onset we found in those was anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes on average. So generally, by the time somebody got through their first beverage, they were feeling the initial effects. The offset, which is also important, generally could run up to 2 hours. So if somebody, that's why we really encourage the idea of starting with that lower dose. You could have a 5 or 10 milligram beverage. And when we did sell also prepackaged cannabis beverages, and a lot of those started at 5 milligrams, some at 10. But again, that's a conversation with each consumer. Again, somebody who is an experienced consumer who can consume 50 milligrams of edibles, like that's their sort of starting point. Obviously, we would sell them a 10 milligram beverage, and they might smoke flower with that as well. Another thing to remember too, and this is sort of thinking about a beverage program, we actually will probably work in a couple of these future projects with even starting with like a 1 milligram dose. Because what I found for myself and going into the venue and, not working, just there to meet some friends and have a good time, is that I found that 2.5 milligram beverage for me was my comfort level, because I knew I was going somewhere after, and it was just part of my evening, right? I think if there was a reason to stay a little longer, et cetera, or even when there was, I would switch to the non-infused beverages just because I have a high sensitivity. But if I could have ordered 3 1 milligram beverages, one as a business, I'm now selling you 3 drinks instead of 1. So that's another thing to think about as a business, is you're going to actually make more money per cover if I sell you a low dose thing. And it's the same at a bar, right? I know cannabis and alcohol aren't the same, but when you go to a bar and you sit at the bar top, they don't put a bottle of liquor in front of you with a glass and you just sort of serve yourself and drink as much as you want. Generally, most people are not ordering Bacardi 151 because they want maximum alcohol, right? We know that in this market that THC percentages have a certain appeal, but I think for beverages in particular, the goal is to have a social setting, and so we want you to consume more than just one. So there's just a lot to think about from a business perspective, but also from that regulatory perspective, right? Beverages do make a lot of sense for these businesses for all the reasons that have already been outlined. But again, just to highlight, it's also a way to increase revenues as a business, because I want to sell you 3 drinks versus 1.
Scott Maddox.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Scott, first of all, thank you for being one of the few that spell your name right. I appreciate it.
That second T is superfluous, right?
Exactly. And thanks for coming out, and thanks for this interesting information here. So now I'm a traffic safety advocate. I have a little bit of a challenge for you, and then I have a legitimate question. I'm very interested in the beverages part of it. So the first thing is, I'd ask, where are you, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that you haven't seen an uptick in fatal crashes involving cannabis. And where are you getting those statistics? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm looking at the Department of Public Safety statistics that have, according to Nevada, seen an uptick since 2016. They've doubled between 2016, which was the year before you legalized cannabis in your state, to 2021. And I have a copy of those, and I'll put those in there. So in the chat. So I was curious where you got your statistics from. And the second question I have is, do you have any information on the duration of effects of cannabis beverages? Because, as you've talked about, the edibles, it's problematic in businesses because the duration of effects is 4 or 5 hours or whatever it might be. But are beverages a lesser duration, and do we have any evidence of that?
No, Scott, thank you for those questions. And I'll start with the first one. So what we don't know when somebody does get pulled over for having consumed cannabis is where they consumed it, right? Given there are only 2 cannabis lounges open in Las Vegas today, and that we don't have direct coordinating reports from this person was pulled over, there was an accident, and what was reported was they had been at venue A or venue B. That's what I'm saying, is that
Okay,
that's
fair.
part of the data collected. Now, again, there's only 2 venues. So in the future, right, when we have up to, I think, 37 that will be open in Clark County, right? It is just probability, right, that somebody will have consumed and they will go on their way and go get pulled over, and there could be a direct association with that, right? Which is again why it's so important to focus on not over serving and avoiding overconsumption at these venues. We cannot control what people do in the privacy of their homes or wherever, right? So it's all about that personal responsibility. It's a challenge, right? But it's the same with alcohol. Someone's at home drinking and decides to head out for the night. They're pre-gaming. They didn't even get to the bar and they get, right? So it's really hard to determine where that occurred, but it is something that, we are going to keep an eye out for, right? Is, were you at a place where this was occurring? So that's what I mean by we haven't seen an uptick, because we're not hearing that from Metro. Right, they're not telling us, hey, you guys have a problem. By the way, if there's a problem associated with one of these venues, they could have their license revoked. I mean, that's the whole point of this, right? Is you need to be able to take bad actors and make an example. But there's only 2, and they're both great actors, so not an issue today. The second question was about offset, or how long does it stay?
The duration. Do we have any evidence that the duration, if I understand your thought process correctly, is beverages may be a way to go for, to substitute for edibles because of it acts faster, but is the duration less? Edibles typically have a longer duration, so that would be problematic if you have somebody who's going to be high for 4 hours. They don't want to sit at the bar for 4 hours or the lounge for 4 hours. So do we have any information about beverages maybe having lesser of a duration?
So I'm not an expert, but I can tell you that what we know about a low dose, number one, and the way a beverage is consumed, or how it's processed versus an edible. So an edible, right, it's got to get into the stomach and it's going to take some time to be absorbed into the bloodstream. It just takes longer to move through. It's the way your liver processes, as I understand, the THC. With a beverage, right, you have absorption through the blood vessels in your mouth. It's a much faster consumption because you don't have to break it down. So it gets into the bloodstream faster. And therefore it begins the process of, what do you want to call it, deterioration, degradation, what have you, right, faster. Again, not a scientist, and if somebody else can refute that or give a better example, by all means, but anecdotally, and we did a lot of like just at-home testing with, because you have access to these products that you can make stuff at your home anyways, tinctures and stuff like that. And for, over a 2-year period, just trying to decide, like, which products could we serve that would have a good offset window. Also, it's about the intensity of the high. And so someone who smokes flower, right, there's a delay initially, and then it hits, I think, at like 20-25 minutes is when the max begins, and then it offsets. I don't have any charts to show you, but there's a different onset offset from smoking, vaping, and then consumption of edibles. But within the subcategory of edibles, again, beverages tend to offset more quickly because of the absorption.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, just to make sure that we can get to all the presentations we have today, Julie and Director Stewart, you both have questions. Do you want to ask them together? Julie first, and then have Scott sort of rapid fire answer, and then we'll move on to our next presentation.
Perfect. Yeah, just from a hospitality standpoint, you said you have the managers touch base. We do that a lot at our restaurant, obviously. Have you had an experience where somebody was having a bad experience, or how would you have handled that? What do you tell your managers, and what do they do after that?
Director Stewart?
Yep, and my rapid fire question is, how do your sites go about ensuring that people aren't driving away after consumption and becoming impaired, or being impaired and driving away? How are they promoting ride shares? How are they promoting designated driving? I'd be interested to know how they're tackling that issue.
Both great questions. Thank you. So for the first question, we actually did have an individual who was from Australia who came in, and that I can say I had a very similar experience my first time I went to Amsterdam. And I was like, I want to smoke the most potent thing you've got. And my business partner actually had the exact same experience. 5 years apart. And we sat there and just got through it after a couple of hours. And of course, you're walking there, right? So it was just, but I didn't even feel like I could walk. But we had a gentleman from Australia, had a very similar experience, and we sat him at a table and we just kept giving him water until he felt like he was okay to leave. He wasn't driving. It was just a matter of he wasn't doing well. We did have an area in Smoke and Mirrors that was generally like an overflow area. So he was able to sit back there on one of the couches, drink some water, watch the TV, and kind of just get into a good headspace. One of the clients that we are working with now, we've actually said they need to build into their space, learning from the first one, a room that's just very chill, where somebody who is overconsumed can take the time they need to relax. Obviously, that's square footage. It eats up, revenues, et cetera. But it's cannabis. It's a privilege, and it's different. And we want to make sure that people have a good experience, because the other thing you have to remember in hospitality, if somebody has a bad experience at your venue, they're not going to come back, right? So whether or not it was their fault or your fault, they're probably going to choose not to come back. So yeah, we gave him plenty of time. I think he was there for roughly 2 hours, and then was able to get into a ride share and go back to his hotel because he didn't feel like he was freaking out, right? It was just, he had a lot of anxiety, et cetera. As far as education to the guests, right? That begins before they ever show up, right? So I would encourage through a lot of people, you're going to have potentially some walk-in traffic that aren't going to know much about your business before they show up. They're just going to walk in. Hey, I heard about this. Well, you have a reservation system, which I do think, especially if you're going to offer food and beverage, a restaurant setting, et cetera, really lean into reservations, because in that reservation process, you can do some education at that first touch. But again, it's coming up. You're talking to a host or hostess, right, at the front door. They're going to have you potentially sign a waiver. That's not required, by the way. That was our own for insurance purposes. You signed a waiver that said code of conduct, et cetera. That's a touch point right there. Hey, if you do consume too much, know that we can help you get a ride share. Now, again, you could provide a discount code. You could work with one of the ride share companies to have a special discount code, or just letting them know that, hey, ride shares only take a few minutes. Again, adjacency to the strip at Smoke and Mirrors, there were always plentiful cabs and ride shares available. So, because you don't want someone waiting for a half hour or an hour to get a ride, right? I imagine there are other things you could put in place, right? A lot of that, again, is you don't want to dictate that in statute. And what you're going to want in the regulatory process, in our view, and this is what our state did, was you're going to have to provide a written plan that says how you're going to do it. Again, flexibility. We're going to take, of the 5 tools available to us, we're going to use these 3. At the local level, it's things like 24-hour no-tow policies. It's also, don't require a business where people are going to be consuming cannabis to meet a parking requirement, right? You don't want to encourage people driving to the venue as often, right? And again, depending on the local jurisdiction in certain neighborhoods, some parts of Las Vegas only have street parking, right? So when I go out with friends to those areas, I generally take a ride share. And if I know I'm going to drink anyways, I'm going to take a ride share, right? It's not worth it anymore. So I think a lot of it is education inside the business itself, from the first touch to the last touch, but also how you can promote through reservations on your website, through your social media accounts, and then again, if you want to go a step further, how local jurisdictions or the state can partner with the industry or use some of those tax dollars collected to do some PSAs, right? I think there's a lot of options there, and I think you can explore all of those.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of the task force, Scott, I wanted to thank you a ton for your time and information today. I'm going to reserve the right, in case some task force members have some follow-up questions, to email them along to you that we can circulate answers to the group. But yeah, again, thanks for your time and have a good rest of your day.
All right, you're very welcome. For those who want to reach out, my email address is very simple. It's Scott with 1 T at reset, R-E-S-E-T, reset.vegas. Feel free to send an email. If I can't get you an answer, I can find someone who's smarter than me that can get you an answer.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Director Hudak. We'll talk to you later. Take care, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, to transition to the second Scott presentation of the day. Scott Maddox, you are up. Are you presenting, or are you presenting in conjunction with Director Stewart?
I think I am presenting. Is that correct, Director? Okay, yeah, so it'd be me.
Excellent. The floor is yours. to discuss public safety issues.
Thank you. And do you have, can you give me sharing ability so I can share my screen?
We're working on that.
Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Got it. All right. Can everybody see that PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, good. So
It just
Now we
went away.
can't.
oh, wait a second.
I'm back.
What happened here? Hang on. I'll get it right. Let me try it again.
Very nice ice flows in your background.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So I'm ready to go, and I will tell you right off the bat, I will not take the entire allotted time. So
Can you jump into presentation mode for the slideshow?
can I? Let's see here. How's that? Does that
Nailed
work?
it.
Yep.
All right, perfect. My name is Scott Maddox, as you all know, with 1T, and I am the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor with the Maine Bureau of Highway Safety. I have a background in law enforcement, about 26 years. I was a drug recognition expert instructor with Portland PD for over 20 years. So I have a lot of experience working with impaired drivers, both in and out of the courtroom. So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about highway safety. And I want to talk about just some impaired driving basics. And the reason I want to do that is because in my experience, a lot of folks are not as well versed on the impaired driving law as I think they should be. And particularly if you're going into this industry, which directly affects highway safety in this type of law, I think it would be helpful for the for the committee to learn a little bit about this. Then I want to talk a little bit about suggestions for harm reduction. Now, I'm going to talk about cannabis in a way that might make you think that perhaps, and of course with my background, that you might think I'm anti-cannabis or a cannabis hater or something like that. And I want to put all my cards on the table right at the beginning and tell you that's not true. It's not what I'm about at all. In fact, I have people in my life close to me that utilize the drugs. So it's become a reality. I also am not one of these people that is all reefer madness. I don't want you to think that either. There are certainly a lot worse substances out there. And in many certain circumstances, cannabis is helpful to people in many cases. So I'm going to be doing what I've been charged with to sit on this task force out of respect for all the people here, which, by the way, I think it's been a great experience with a lot of respectful people, a lot of different viewpoints. And I'm going to talk a lot about cannabis, but I'm also going to offer some suggestions as to how you might accomplish your goals, keeping traffic safety concerns in mind. So with that, here we go. I want to talk from a highway safety perspective. We're concerned about any model that includes driving a motor vehicle after the consumption of an impairing substance. So again, I don't want you to think that I'm coming after cannabis hospitality lounges or anything. Any situation where someone is consuming an impairing substance and they're going to be driving at some point after the recent consumption, that's a concern for us. And I would encourage the folks listening to this presentation from the cannabis hospitality angle to think of strong regulations as adding credibility to your industry, because you want to have a good product that is regulated reasonably and safely. So I think that working together with strong regulations on not driving while impaired is helpful for both of our missions. The third point I want to make is, I think it's pretty clear with this committee, is cannabis does impair, and Maine is very rural, and I think that unlike downtown Vegas, where a good majority of the population has access to Uber and rideshare and everything. We have to face the fact here in Maine that a good percentage of your customers are simply not going to have rideshare opportunities. So there will be a significant customer base that will drive after consumption. And that's something that the legislation has to keep in mind. So impaired driving basics. Someone who operates a motor vehicle and at the time of the operation, they're under the influence of intoxicant, whether it's alcohol or drugs or a combination of the two. That's a violation of the law. They have to be operating a vehicle and they have to, at the time of operation, be under the influence. And it can be alcohol, it could be alcohol and drugs, or it could just be drugs. And my point with this slide is, what do we mean by under the influence? And quite frankly, it is however slightly or to any extent. So we don't need to have the person who is falling down drunk, who can't tie their shoes, who can't walk a straight line, who, you know, gets out of the car and has vomit stains down their shirt. That's a different standard. That's visibly intoxicating. Okay. However slightly or to any extent is the standard for operating under the influence in Maine. And that can simply be someone who has impaired motor skills slightly, or even impaired judgment. It doesn't necessarily even have to have a physical manifestation. Someone who runs through a stop sign because they didn't think to stop. And if we can connect that to the intoxicant that they've consumed recently, that could be a violation of the law. So not to belabor that point, but that what I want folks to understand is that it's a very low level of impairment that people have to obtain to be arrested for that one. So the problem, of course, with cannabis is that unlike alcohol, there is no scientifically accepted blood measure level. So, you know, we have the magic number with alcohol, it's 0.08. And if we get a blood test and someone's consumed alcohol and they're 0.08 or more, then they violated the law. It's a very objective measurement. We don't have that with cannabis. And we have further problems with cannabis because blood levels of THC, of course, the impairing substance that's in cannabis, do not correspond with measured levels of impairment. We have a lot of scientific studies, and I've included them in my handout that I've sent to the group that I'd like to put on the record, is we have a lot of scientific studies that show that people have THC levels all over the place, and they are not corresponded with measured levels of impairment. And also, blood levels of THC do not correspond with self-reported perceptions of impairment. So we can have people that have 10 nanograms of THC in their blood and they feel fine. And then we have other people that have 5 milligrams of THC in their blood and they'll tell you that they feel very, very impaired. So it's not, the point of this slide is it's not an objective measurement. We have to, in other words, evaluate everybody individually, and people react individually differently to this drug before we can tell whether or not someone's impaired. So in summary, it's, you know, for a cannabis impaired driving situation, you don't even need to measure someone's blood because the blood measurement is irrelevant, whether they have 10 milligrams of THC or 100 milligrams of THC. That you cannot tell from that whether or not they're impaired. It's all based upon how the person acts and how they react and how they feel. NHTSA has a great slogan here: if you feel different, you drive different. And, you know, again, they're basing that on the fact that, you know, we can have changes in mental functioning, however slight, and that's impairment. And of course, cannabis is a drug that makes people feel different, right? Isn't that the whole point of the cannabis consumption facility is to go to a place where we can have social interactions and we can feel more comfortable, etc. And basically, I want to conclude this section with just saying people should not be driving until the duration of effects of the drugs have concluded. And we have to think about our legalization for these sort of licensing. We have to think about it in that way. how do we administer this stuff and get people through the duration of effects before we let them drive. Again, not to bore you with science, and there's a bunch of resources attached, but I do want to show just one very recent policy, and you know, the other Scott from Nevada, I appreciate his professionalism and his information, but I'm going to disagree with him that we have not seen an increase in cannabis-involved fatalities since it's been legalized. And in fact, here's a really good study in the International Journal of Drug Policy, which looked at every state that's legalized recreational cannabis. And they have seen an increase in traffic fatalities, 2.2 per billion miles driven, accounting for statistical regression analysis and chance. It's a very interesting article that looks at all of the states, including Maine. What we haven't seen an increase is in the public perception that cannabis use before driving is dangerous. And you can read through this material later if you'd like, but and I don't think we have to talk about it much, but I think most everybody would agree is that the perception is cannabis is not dangerous to drive under the influence of, or some version of that. For example, in the first survey, 2,000 cannabis users, 49% drive high but wouldn't drive drunk. And 64% say they feel safer driving high than drunk. You know, impairment is impairment. And there's really not a lot of justification for feeling differently whether you're impaired by alcohol or drug as far as safety is concerned. So cannabis impairs, and it's different than alcohol. Cannabis has, of course, THC, which we talked about, which is indisputably an impairing substance. And one of the things that it does, which I want the committee to think about strongly, is that it impairs people's ability to gauge their own driving ability. By nature, impairment is the inability to react like you normally would, and that includes mental facilities as well. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. We have a lot of scientific evidence that points to this, is that people will subjectively report they feel fine to drive, but then they'll test them and they'll take blood samples at the same time, and they score lower while under the influence of cannabis. You know, so it's a common perception that cannabis is not impairing or as impairing as alcohol. And with some people, they claim they drive better while under the influence. And in fact, there's absolutely zero scientific evidence of that. There is not one single scientific study that's ever been done that shows that people who are under the influence of cannabis drive better. Just think about it. If that were the case, we would be giving out cannabis on highway safety. So that was my one joke for the time. All right, alcohol and cannabis are different. Wrapping it up here, and then I'm going to go into some of the suggestions that I would want to give to the committee about, you know, how we might approach this. But first, why I'm coming to some of these suggestions, I'm going to explain here. Alcohol and cannabis are different. Again, not to pick on Scott, but he suggested something earlier about, you know, we want to introduce cannabis into every situation where alcohol is. And I have a little bit of an issue with that because, again, they're different substances. They're different molecules. Cannabis is a lot more complicated, and they impair people differently. So I don't know that it's appropriate that in every situation where alcohol is sold, cannabis should be sold. So alcohol is one product. Cannabis is multiple products. Alcohol has an onset that is predictable. And, you know, we give somebody 2 or 3 beers, and we can tell by their weight and by the time of period that it takes them to consume the alcohol, how intoxicated they're going to be in an hour or 2. Cannabis, the onset is variable. It doesn't rise in a nice little bell curve like it does with alcohol. The different products are different. We talked about it earlier, you know, with edibles, of course, having a different onset than smoking, vaping, or drinking. The duration with alcohol, it's predictable. again, if we have someone who has consumed 4 beers and it's noon, I can use a scientific formula to tell you when they're going to be sober to drive. I can tell you at 5:13 p.m. they'll be able to drive. Not so with cannabis. The duration, again, is variable. That's why I asked Scott about whether or not we know the duration of cannabis liquids. Because cannabis edibles, we know the duration can be 6 to 8 hours. If liquids are taking effect faster, they may, the duration may last less, and that might be a viable product for a cannabis hospitality setting. But the measurement of impairment, going back to alcohol, it's precise. We have an objective indicator at 0.08 or more. We know that someone is impaired. We don't have that precise measure of impairment with cannabis. Tolerance with alcohol, a pretty narrow scope. You know, certainly we have people that can consume more alcohol than others on a regular basis. But with cannabis, it's really a significantly wide scope. There are folks that can consume, you know, we've done cannabis trainings in Green Labs. We've had people consume 600 milligrams of THC in 2 hours and walked a straight line, been completely sober. And we've had other people that have had half of a 5 milligram gummy bear and almost passed out. So it certainly depends on experience and a whole lot of other things. And then finally, scientific knowledge. You know, we can speak confidently about alcohol and impairment and its connection to traffic safety because we've been studying it for 80 plus years. We can't do that with cannabis. It's only been legal for 10 years. Colorado legalized it in 2014, I think it was. And so prior to that, scientists weren't studying it. We don't have a lot of knowledge about what it does to someone and certainly the long-term effects. And moreover, on this point, the concoctions that are coming out today involving cannabis and the genetic alteration of cannabis and other things like that have produced, you know, some high THC potencies that we have never seen before. And we certainly don't have a lot of evidence about what those do. So for all those reasons, here are some of the suggestions. I've got 5 of them. Number 1, mandatory impairment training for cannabis or cannabis product servers. And I think we're going to talk a lot about that later. So I won't I won't delay the point here. But definitely, if we're going to license cannabis hospitality facilities, there has to be mandatory training. And I suggest very strongly it's mandatory because for the license, because if it's voluntary, it won't happen. And I don't know exactly what the training should be, but I think that we should look at experts. Like, for example, I suggested the Criminal Justice Academy utilizes its drug recognition expert program to work with what we have currently for seller server. And it wouldn't be the first time the Academy was legislatively mandated to create a training, but they deal with impairment all the time. And I think that that might be a very viable source to create some sort of training. Secondly, serving size and wait time regulations. Now, I don't know what those should be, but I think we should go to experts to get some suggestions. I can tell you that it would be a mistake to allow a cannabis facility to serve someone, you know, a 25 milligram gummy bear at midnight when they close at 10, or excuse me, close at 1. So there has to be some sort of reasonable regulation as to what the limits are. And again, I think the discussion with Scott was informative. They've done some stuff in Nevada, and we should definitely look at that. Introduce a Cannabis Liability Act. And by the way, this is also something that was done in Nevada before the public safety would agree to license those places, is Cannabis Liability Act. Much like Maine's Liquor Liability Act, we should have a Cannabis Liability Act. And again, no matter how good we are at doing what we do, and no matter how good the cannabis dealers are with selling different products and having cannabis hospitality or dispensaries, someone somewhere will violate the rules and they will get overly impaired, and there will be victims. And so these victims should be able to have a clear path to hold whoever is responsible for that, to the fire. And a Cannabis Liability Act would enable that. So I think that we should really stand behind that. And then also ensures accountability for establishment, and again, adds credibility to the whole cannabis industry. They want to be regulated and treated like alcohol sellers, then we should also have a Cannabis Liability Act. And then finally, in conclusion, data collection strategies. No, sorry, I have one more. I miscounted. I can't count to 5 today. Data collection strategies is number 4. I think that whatever it is that we do, we should establish a procedure to collect data so that 10 years down the road, the next generation of people licensing will have some hard data to account for what's happening. And I don't know exactly how you measure that, but there's a lot of challenges, but I think that should come with whatever initiative you push forward, because if we're going to implement a program, we need some hard data to know how it's affecting society. And now finally, my last one is, I just can't in my mind get around any way it's safe to allow establishments to serve both alcohol and cannabis. Crossfading, as you all know, is a real possibility. It's popular with young people. There's some scientific studies that show it, even one drink doubles the amount of THC that a person is receiving. And I just think that when you have crossfading, it throws all of the calculations right out the window. We can't just look and see, the bartender can't just look and see, well, this person's had 2 or 3 drinks. We shouldn't go over another one in the next hour, or they've had 1 or 2 pre-rolls. You can't do it that way when crossfading occurs, because it doesn't just double the strength of the dosage, but it leads to exponentially unpredictable impairment. So in conclusion, I think keeping cannabis impaired drivers off the road protects both of our interests, highway safeties and the cannabis industry. And strong regulations will help keep drivers safe and help keep the market healthy. Because the last thing we want is, a traumatic event, and someone came from a cannabis hospitality thing and puts a unnecessary black mark on everything. So I know I flew through all of that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and happy to answer questions. I know there's a lot of information there.
Scott, thank you for that. Before we jump to questions, Director Stewart, I just want to offer a moment in case you wanted to add or follow up on anything, but otherwise we can jump into questions.
Thank you very much for that, Director, but I think you just heard from the expert, and those are all the opinions of the Department of Public Safety Bureau of Highway Safety. So there's very little that I can add to that, other than my wish is that we do implement some of those recommendations, or we do put forth some of those recommendations ultimately when we put forth whatever package it is that we're going to present to the legislature, to show that we have thoughtfully thought about the public safety of the people who may be attending or participating in the cannabis consumption sites. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Gabby?
I guess one of my questions would be, Scott, we talked a lot about consumption of cannabis and then alcohol, or alcohol and then cannabis. I guess prohibiting it on co-location on site is one way to prevent that. impairment recognition training for cannabis servers is certainly another. Do you have any additional recommendations to prevent or to address issues where, because if it's happening in the same location, they'll know, like the servers will know. But what happens when you've got somebody who goes from the cannabis bar in the old port to the liquor bar in the old port? Like, do you have any suggestions to mitigate that risk?
Well, my only suggestion for that is that the state should mandate seller server training for anyone who's serving alcohol as well. They currently don't. So, you know, and again, I realize, and, you know, people are already doing it, and it will happen. And I know that it's not the cannabis industry's fault or mandate to prevent people from doing what they want to do in their own. But I think it's reasonable to require impairment training before serving, because impairment is impairment. As far as the law goes, it doesn't matter whether it came from cannabis or alcohol or a mixture of two. We just don't want people on the road operating a 6,000 pound rocket when they're impaired. So if we, you know, one of the recommendations could be to mandate both alcohol and cannabis sellers.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right. Last call for questions. Okay, with that, we thank you, Scott, for the data and the information.
I'm impressed. I've silenced everybody.
all the news that's fit to speak, I guess. But we'll thank you for the and for the recommendations. Really appreciate that. Those will certainly be a topic we engage with as we're discussing post meeting and then drafting a report. It is 2:13. I have on my TikTok that we should break from 2:20 to 2:35, so we're somehow a little bit ahead of schedule. So let's plan to take a 20-minute break. We'll be back at 2:35. And thank you guys for your attention so far. Time for a Starbucks or a Dunkin'. All right, everyone, welcome back. We are going to jump into a discussion about employee training. Jiffy is going to lead that discussion and presentation, so I will turn it over to you, Jiffy.
Let me just give you a little bit of my background. I coordinate the Substance Use Prevention Services Program at the City of Portland's Division of Public Health. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, as well as a certified prevention specialist, and I also have mental health first aid certification. I've been in the field of substance use for about almost 19 years, and 14 of that was in the treatment sector, and then I moved into the prevention pillar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm also a certified responsible beverage server trainer, and I'm also the cannabis vendor trainer in the city of Portland. So I have a little information about both, because I know that there's questions about the RBS training and how that flows, and then also talk a little bit about the training I'm doing in Portland and the training that I feel like we need to standardize to the state. So let's first talk about state and RBS. The state doesn't mandate alcohol server seller training, and it's been leaving it up to the municipalities. So right now in the state of Maine, only 4 municipalities have ordinances requiring alcohol server seller training: Portland, Bangor, Kennebunk, and Acton. Portland's alcohol training, the city of Portland also has an alcohol training ordinance, its ordinance, I'm sorry, requires server seller training within 90 days of employment with a licensee. So a lot of times while I offer the RBS training, it's usually individuals coming in who might be new to the industry, or it's people who have had it and need to have like a 3-year recert. But a lot of times in Portland, the establishments are hiring someone to come in and train their entire staff. So I'm not really sure how it works. Scott might be able to answer this, and maybe even Jamie, if you know the answer. It may be required by the establishment's liability insurance coverage. So I don't know a lot about the liability coverage for alcohol establishments. So liquor licensees can choose to do the Serve Safe or Serve Smart, RBS or TIPS. Most of them choose TIPS or RBS. TIPS was developed by the alcohol industry. It's not necessarily specific to the state of Maine, but it does give a lot of, there's a lot of role playing, it's a longer training, and it mostly talks about recognizing impairment and refusal of sale and ID checking. RBS was developed by in a partnership between Bablo and the Maine CDC with input from the other departments in the state. So it is very specific to Maine state law, administrative law specifically, and consequences, administrative consequences as well as civil consequences. So the RBS certification is good for 3 years. It's about 3 to 3.5 hour class. It's actually extended a little bit because of the delivery discussion that we have now. It includes a pre-test and a post-test, which is required for certification. And it can be provided in person or virtually. Of course, in person is preferred by most of the trainers, I think, just because it leads to more conversation. And we actually ask for input from our participants on like what their experience has been, because there's always like the new person who started within 90 days and then the person who's been in the industry for 10+ years. So I included a sheet of like the outline of what RBS trainings. Unfortunately, I can't share the training with you. It's a printed document just because you have to be certified. But there is an outline. It's actually printed 2 sheets of paper. I'm going to pass out here. So just if you want to take a look at it, I'm just going to refer to a couple of key points of the RBS trainings. One of the things is that I feel like we say it every other slide in RBS, is that we talk about the 3 best practices, which is having a policy, having a written policy where everyone knows where to find it, around you know, how are we refusing sales, what the processes and procedures are around impairment, 3-second assessment at the table, and ID checking and retaining. Another thing we obviously are constantly promoting, and this is continuing to attend the training on a regular basis. RBS has only recently changed, but for a long time it was the same curriculum all the way throughout. It changed a little bit when delivery went into effect. So it doesn't really change. It's kind of the same information, and people are like, oh, well, I took it, you know, whenever. But their certifications only last for 3 years, and it's really good to have on hand for the establishment's liability insurance. The other thing is that we are constantly talking about working as a team within the establishment. So another thing we talk about are the effects of alcohol, how, you know, the effects on the body, the effects on the brain, just a little bit of kind of prevention work around it and biology. And then of course we talk about BAC, which is not something you would talk about in cannabis vending training, but we may discuss the Mellanby effect. And if any of you ever heard of the Mellanby effect, it's when, with alcohol, it's when someone stops drinking, but they continue to become more intoxicated. So it's because the only way to battle intoxication is by time. You got to just kind of let it wear off. And Mellanby effect actually can bring somebody's BAC up before it starts bringing it down, even if it's been an hour after they've stopped drinking. So it's just the way we metabolize alcohol through our liver. Also, we talk about what a standard drink is. You know, the 2 ounces of hard liquor versus the size of a wine, which I can't remember, 4 ounces, I think, of wine, and an 8 ounce beer, 12 ounce beer, depending on the ABV as well, alcohol by volume. Then we get into the stuff that I always say, this is going to scare you, and I don't mind that it does. But we start talking to the participants about the administrative laws and the consequences. So for alcohol, administrative fine would be $1,500 for the server and for the licensee. And then in the outline, you can see some of those topics that we talked about under the administrative violations, which could be, you know, maybe they have too much signage out, all kinds of rules that sometimes the servers are like, well, that's a management thing, but they should really just be aware of. How liquor is purchased, like the manager couldn't call and say, hey, can you pick up a case of vodka on your way in, because there needs to be certain paperwork taken to an agency liquor store. So, and then wine and beer has to be purchased through a distributor. We also talk a lot about the Liquor Liability Act and what that means. And so, as Scott talked about, the Liquor Liability Act it really is, it both is protection for the establishment as well as protection for the person who may have gotten hurt with a third party who may have gotten hurt in an accident involving either a minor who's been consuming or any person who consumed and injured, killed, or had caused damage. And sorry, my voice does start to go away after a few minutes. And with the Liquor Liability Act, there is a max, it's $350,000 per incident. And that can actually, with several liability, that can be shared among whoever's named in the litigation. So it could be the owner of the establishment, the server. I mean, servers could walk away with the entire $350,000 fine. It's civil, so. And then we also talk about the dram shop law. And I don't know if everyone understands dram shop law, but the dram shop law is it's unlimited medical coverage through the life of the person for any medical issues that, well, pretty much go on for life. So I'll use, for example, I always use this as an example. I have a cousin who was 7 when he and his mom got hit head on by a trio of drunk teenage girls. This was back in late 80s. And he was, and it was before shoulder harnesses in cars. And so he severed his spinal cord and became a quadriplegic. And so those girls and their parents actually have paid for his medical bills right up until he passed away at the age of 45. So that's Dram Shop. We also talk, oh, the other thing I should say about the Liquor Liability Act and several liability in Dram Shop is that part of my presentation in Portland, because of the way Portland is laid out and because it's very much urban, is that I always make a recommendation for each of the licensees to create their own safe ride accounts. So some of the establishments have created their own Uber or Lyft accounts, and when they have to say no to somebody, when they have to refuse or send somebody away, they call the Uber themselves, or they call the Lyft themselves. So, because there is that, like, there's a part in liquor law that requires that people have intoxicated people removed right away, but then there's also that feeling from the establishment, like public safety wise, are they going to go out and get in their car? So this was one of the, it's not a fix, but it's it seems to be working a little bit better. And some of the places have been doing it, which I think has been great. So they also, some of them have contracts with taxis. We don't have very many taxis left, but another thing that we always talk about is the importance of documenting incidents. Because if something does happen and law enforcement comes back and starts asking questions, then it should be documented right away, really, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So we are always making sure that they have a logbook of some kind, an incident logbook that's accessible by all staff and management. We talk a lot about impairment detection and sale refusal. There's a cute little video on it, an animated video that was put together, which is actually kind of fun to watch. I learn from it every time. And so there's, and then obviously we talk about it for quite a while afterwards. And then there's also the section of assessing age and checking IDs and what we do to, about the procedures around retaining IDs and the laws around that. And then we, at the end, we talk about policy guidance. So we do some, make some suggestions around policies, written policies that they should have on hand that are, again, accessible by all the staff so they can go check and see what's written. So that's kind of the, yeah, you need to look at the outline to kind of really get into the nuts and bolts of it. But that's just kind of a basic overview of the RBS training. I really enjoy doing the RBS training. It's a lot of good information. I get information back. There's always the discussion about what happens when they've gone to a cannabis retail store, eaten their edible on the way to their restaurant reservation. What does that look like? And unfortunately, all I can tell them is once they've entered your establishment, you're responsible for them. So they are, they're building relationships with cannabis industry within the city to talk about how can we work together and make this safer. So when it comes to cannabis vending training, there's no state mandate. Portland had the foresight, because we have a public health department, but a public health person who was very vocal on making sure that we have an annual training requirement within the state and within the city. So Portland is actually, as far as I know, unless it's changed very recently, it's the only municipality that has an ordinance requiring training of all customer-facing, pretty much customer-facing retail staff. So The code is chapter 35-43. In its annual training, it says each manager of any marijuana retail store or dispensary and all frontline staff of each marijuana retail store or dispensary must attend a city-approved training within 90 days of beginning in that position, and then annually thereafter. Employing a manager or frontline staff that does not have the required training may be grounds for suspension. And Chris can talk a little bit more about that. And then if the training program is provided by Department of Health and Human Services, the city's department, the department shall charge a fee for the cost of the class. Up to this point, I've been funded to do this training, so we haven't had to charge for the class. And then the second part of that ordinance is that retail stores must submit a list of employees annually with their license renewal, along with verifications they have successfully completed a city-approved training program. At one time, when we only had a very few retailers in the city, vendors, they were given certificates, but now that I'm training over 230 people, we keep a database that we share between inspections and permitting and public health, where I record attendance and I have a triple check of attendance. I get a report through the meeting software. I have them sign in the chat, and then I also do one of the artificial intelligence AI like meeting guru guys. So they record it, and I can verify attendance that way. So we triple check it. And then I, of course, maintain the attendance spreadsheet or database which is shared with permitting and inspections. So unfortunately, Portland's training is not set up the same way RBS is, and the truth is that our vendors are asking for that. But because of the way legislation keeps working and things keep changing, and we can't keep up with it, it's been hard to make a kind of a standardized training where we're talking about administrative laws and what fines look like and liability and that kind of thing. So Portland's cannabis training has been very heavy on the youth cannabis use prevention and safety topics. So the objective, we talk about what my program is and what we do. I also introduced our harm reduction services program around naloxone and Narcan trainings, and make that available to our retailers because a lot of them are downtown, and there's been an interest in that. We talk about youth brain development, substance use prevention strategies. We talk a lot about emergency response to accidental ingestion, and give them a lot of data around emergency department visits and poison control calls. We talk about safe storage practices for families. I implore them. I feel like I preach to them, and I always tell them that, but I must say at least 6 times per training, and it's only an hour training. Please consider carrying safe storage options in the store, whether it's just a lock that you can install in a cabinet or, a full lock box or a lock pouch. And I have a slide actually that gives all kinds of options, locked canisters, locked drawers, that kind of thing. We talk a little bit about impairment, but again, impairment with cannabis is different than alcohol. So it's just, it's more like these are the symptoms. And then we talk about like, you got to use your best judgment. There's not a lot of guidance for this right now, and I keep promising that at some point we'll have better training for around that. In Portland, we have required signage, public health signage that they're required to have at point of sale that talks about like public health points. Pregnant people shouldn't be smoking cannabis. All these, age 21. It's actually, the signs are actually made specifically. There's one specific to AU, and then there's one specific to medical use. And just so you know, it's something Chris reminded me last week is that we consider, because they're retailers, it doesn't matter if they're medical or adult use, they're retailers. So even medical use has to take this training in order to continue their licensing. And then we, of course, give them support resources. We talk about the prevention for me program, the cannabis toolkit, and poison control center phone numbers. We talk about pets and THC, which I have to be honest, I get more of a reaction from than I do when I talk about kids accidentally ingesting THC. So I've taken advantage of that and use that as an awareness point. And then a couple of years, well, it's been what, 2 years, I think, we created a work group, myself, a staff member from Bangor Public Health, both Lexis, I think, were on it, as well as a couple of other prevention specialists in the state, got together to develop a state standardized training. And I was gonna actually do an outline of that, but I feel like it needs to be changed again, so. It's never gone into effect. I think, Scott, you may have actually reviewed it at one point. So it was developed between New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center. So if anybody knows that, Scott Gagnon, he's our policy expert, or was. And so he kind of spearheaded the whole thing, kind of put the training together, taking pieces from the training that I do, as well as another training that someone else had introduced. Maine CDC was there, OCP was there, and then again, representatives from the prevention public health realm, including Bangor, Portland, South Portland, Wyndham Raymond, and Westbrook Partners for Prevention. So it's still in draft form. And because of the legislative updates, it needs to be updated again, and maybe just kind of changed around and put more, like kind of following more of the RBS format, and the information the RBS gives. And so hopefully maybe that will be ready at some point to provide. I would hope that it requires that you have a trainer get certified like RBS does. That's kind of the overview of what training looks like so far for cannabis, and just the review of the RBS training. So what's funny is all of my suggestions mirror Scott's suggestions. With maybe a caveat. So some of my suggestions are training is mandated to all individual certifications through OCP. So when an individual registers, they should have a requirement for receiving a training, as well as every time they be licensed. So every 2 years. And then I also would suggest that OCP look into creating a training coordinator position. Just because if I'm maintaining 230, just in the city of Portland. So if you have across the state however many licensees, and they have 3 to 12 employees that all need to be certified, then they probably should all have the training. So that's a lot of people. I think there needs to be a decision around standard serving size. Again, like Scott said, we have standard drinks, so obviously standard dosage in the hospitality realm, and then looking again into Cannabis Liability Act, and probably adding a dram shop lot to that. That is pretty much all I have to share. If anybody has any questions about RDS training, or how we do, how we coordinate cannabis vendor training, if you want to add anything about our ordinances, that would be great. But that's kind of the overview.
No, I think the database is a good tool from the enforcement side of things. So when I go to do inspections, we can check and see if that employee has had the training or not. We require it for what we consider frontline employees. So that's pretty much anybody that's like public facing. So like a door greeter or a bartender, We recommend that anybody that uses their social media accounts also have that. But it's not so much for the backline employees, like in a manufacturing or cultivation, it's not,
Although we do have some cultivation within delivery, so they're required.
Yeah, because they're that front line kind of facing at that point. So it is a good tool to use the database overall.
And their licenses have been put on hold, licensing has been put on hold for lack of taking the training, or if like a majority have taken the training and there might be one more, that person, they could get relicensed, but that one person can't work until they've taken the training. And I was doing the training monthly just because of the number of people that I had to see, so.
Questions?
I guess more of a, I'm the RBS coordinator at Maine CBC is on my team, so I'm a little familiar with the work and just to level set like the lift of this. It's a pretty substantial lift, and so I would definitely echo like resourcing someone or multiple someones to really be doing this, because like on our side, my counterpart has completely overhauled the RBS training to reflect current statute and changes, but also runs multiple train the trainer classes and certifies new trainers every year. And the logistics of that, coordinating with Bablo and making sure people have their tests and are certified to then be going out and teaching classes and documenting. It is a lot of work. And unfortunately, currently, to be delivering this to licensees that pretty much are opting into it, since it's not currently a requirement in most municipalities. We've had some federal grant funding that supports this work, but I think when we're talking about the potential for a cannabis training requirement for anyone, which I fully support, I think the resource needs for that are going to be substantially higher. And so just thinking about like logistically what that looks like. I know there are some trainings in other states, like I think Colorado has like an online module, which folks have looked at and reviewed. And I think there's great information there. The downside of that is that it doesn't reflect Maine's current statute. And I think where we're growing so rapidly, it really needs to be something that's specific to Maine to protect licensees and the public. So I would just implore the group to think about strong recommendations around the resourcing of something like that.
Lexi, Heather?
Hey everyone, I just wanted to, so you actually beat me to it. I was going to mention many states do this type of training, especially when it needs to be annual. They do it on an online basis. And also, I know in Massachusetts and a few other states, the regulatory body regulates the trainer. So, or picks the companies, what have you, that can give the training. So that way, it's less resource dependent on the regulatory body. They are responsible for making sure that the trainers' training materials are accurate, up to date. And then then it becomes when you get your badge, Massachusetts badges are still annual. When you get your badge, you have to prove that you've had the training. I'm curious what folks think about, Scott mentioned mandatory training in the cannabis space, and then mentioned, which we already knew, that training's not mandatory in the alcohol space, and whether we have an appetite to try to tie them together, or encourage both. Or are we singling ourselves out by saying, well, we think that mandatory training is necessary on our side, but not on the alcohol side. And then I guess my third point on that is, I believe that right now, businesses that do give their employees alcohol training, so that would be like a store employee. who's selling alcohol at a cash register. There is some kind of benefit to them. I don't know what the benefit is, but could the model be a benefit for taking the training versus requiring the training?
So I will answer, I can speak to one thing around the alcohol training is that for liquor licenses, the only person that has to have any kind of license or anything is the establishment. Individual servers don't have to have certification like the registration that they do with cannabis. So there's no way to kind of know who needs to have the training if it were to become mandated. So Bablo would have to probably put in some kind of process or procedure the same way that OCP has around getting an IIC or an RIC or a CGE registration. So that is probably the biggest barrier, I would think.
It's not going to fly. I mean, I just can't imagine that would gain any traction legislatively.
So Heather, what I'll say is, well, I think it's important for this group to make sure that it stays in its lane in terms of sticking to the legislative mandate and focusing on cannabis hospitality. I think we've, as a group, discussed enough about polysubstance consumption, concerns that can arise as a cannabis business, whether your employees are able to identify alcohol inebriation properly and make those questions about serving, that if the group did desire to make a recommendation that alcohol and cannabis responsible server training be mandated, I don't think that that is so far out of the lane of what the mandate is here, especially because there does seem to be so much cohesion. If the group prefers just to make a recommendation on cannabis, not make a recommendation, that's up to all of you. But certainly our goal here isn't to crack open all the liquor statutes and regulations, but I do think that this is reasonably related if the group did see value in it. I will say, personally, I think that regardless of what happens, liquor and cannabis responsible server training should speak to each other. I don't think that's going too far, but I'll just sort of put that out there as something the group can consider. But Heather also raised some additional questions, so happy to hear from the group what their perspectives are. Or if there are additional questions for Jake. Gabby.
3, and I wish they were more related, but they're not. So first is, how do you determine the period of certification? So 1 year versus 3 years. Second, just based on your discussions through the cannabis training in particular, or I shouldn't say, no, the alcohol training, the liquor training, how many of the folks around the table when you were training them have in fact encountered folks who they're pretty sure came in under the influence of cannabis? And then the third question is, because I know we get it in our office, is how many folks are asking you to provide them with standardized policies developed by the city for some of the places where you're recommending policy development?
I don't have anything to do with policy development.
Okay, great.
My job is to stay in my lane and just provide the training. Ask your first question again.
Yeah. It was, how do you determine the period of certification for 1 year versus 3 years versus 6 months? You know?
Bablo is the one that determined the 3-year certification for RBS. And I think it's RBS tips. I'm not sure how they all fall in together because I'm not tip certified, and I don't choose to be. And then the ordinance that went into
the city ordinance in the 1 year came from the council discussion when they originally enacted the ordinance from HHS department as a 1 year recommendation.
But we've talked about basing it off now that they can register every 2 years.
Every 2 years, yeah.
Changing it to that, but that would be something the city would need to do.
Okay.
So.
How many folks are you running into who have experience with polysubstance?
Both ways?
Yeah.
It's a conversation. It's usually, okay, so this cannabis vendor training, I don't do a lot in person just because it's usually like everybody's on a different schedule, so I don't do just one establishment. So there's usually not a lot of discussion or conversation on those. They're an hour. I pretty much fill the hour. Ask for any feedback. I do get questions every now and then after, or if they're not something I can answer, they're around policy or inspections or licensing. I refer them to Chris, which actually most of them are. But when it comes to the RBS training, I do that primarily in person, and we can spend a good 15 to 20 minutes all together on like, what do we do about this? And, you know, how should we handle this? And it's just that constantly, like, you just gotta do that 3-second assessment when a person comes in, and they may not be intoxicated or impaired when they first walk in, but you know, an hour later, because metabolism and digestion takes time, they may have to make some decisions at that point. But it does go the other way, because we've had, when I do my retailer visits and to bring printed materials, prevention materials to them, they're constantly saying, you know, asking, how do we handle the folks that just came from the bar next door and want to come in and do cannabis and or you know, purchase, and it's the same thing. So yeah, and so like I said, there's people who are within a couple blocks of each other, especially in the old port, because that's where the concentration is. There's you know, there's a lot more talking going on between the two different places.
I've got a quick question, then I'll jump to Rose. How much communication is there among you, your colleagues in Bangor, Acton, and Kennebunk about RBS?
I mean, we've all been trained. Well, Acton and Kennebunk are done in York County, so it's done by the different prevention specialists who are usually contracted through CDC, through the main prevention network. So we all get trained the same way through CDC and that, but the truth is I don't really have a lot of connection with them when it comes to RBS. I might, if they can't do one, they don't have a trainer available, I can go down and do training for them, and that's about it. Yeah.
So I mean, I may be the only person in the room that doesn't know, but what is BABLO?
Oh, Bureau of Alcoholic Beverage and Lottery Operations.
Okay, so I figured it was Bureau of Alcohol, and I didn't know what the rest of it was.
Sorry. I usually say the whole thing and then start using it.
No, you weren't the first one to use it. It's been brought up before. I just thought I'd ask. Thank you. So I heard you talk about a couple of things. I think one recommendation that you said, I think you made, that you make to, or would make to people in the cannabis hospitality setting, that they would have some sort of ride account that they can send somebody.
I would make the recommendation, yeah.
And
It would
who
be
pays for
nice.
that?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's always like, you know, would they fit the bill themselves, or is there a way to add the fee onto the bill?
And get the employer or the state to reimburse it. And then, so all of my questions, a lot of the concerns that I've heard in talking with people who are in the cannabis industry already, business owners specifically, is the licensing and the million costs that go along with operating these businesses. You know, everybody wants a license and you know, and there's this fee and that fee and training fee. So I heard you also say that you have grant funding for your current cannabis retail training, but when that funding runs out, who is going to pay for that training and what is the cost?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, so it's not just recovery.
Can I follow up on that, Rose?
Yeah.
Does the grant money subsidize that training, or does it cover it for the businesses, or do individuals taking it also pay a fee?
It covered my salary, and it became a part of our work plan for the.
And what's the fee to take the class?
There has never been an established
Oh,
fee
okay.
for cannabis vendor because it's been covered under my salary.
Okay.
But when you talked about the ordinance and the way it's written, does it not state that that could be passed on?
It
to-
could be.
Okay,
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that I heard you properly.
We have tried not to do that because it is mandated, so we're, you know, we're trying to be good neighbors, just like they're trying to be good
No, I just wanted,
neighbors.
I processed properly.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, Rose.
Oh, no, that's fine. And then your 3-factor authentication, what was the third one? You said something about AI, so you're just checking to make sure. that
Oh, for
people aren't
attendance,
just
so the first
turning on their
one,
computer and leaving.
I make them sign into the chat. And then have a report that comes to me, saying everybody that was there signed in. If there are multiple people, sometimes they all go to a conference room at their establishment and I make them come off camera and show me everybody that's there. If they sign in with multiple people in the chat. And then I use Fred from Firefly Fred, who's an AI note taker.
Oh.
So he actually audio records everything and the chat and everybody that was there.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess my only, over regulation, there's a lot of things to consider. But, for many people, I'm going to say again that the effects of cannabis and the effects of alcohol are very different. I would say, as I've said here, I mean, I just talk to people about this all the time now when I'm out and about seeing anyone. And, there is a big appetite for cannabis hospitality. I know that. And there's also, I just think, we have the ability to not overregulate out of the gate and to just, be mindful of the cost of operation for the businesses that want to do this. I know that there are people in the state also who can do cannabis training, who are very familiar and aware and more knowledgeable than us, maybe. So those are just my things. It's just, the expense for the business operator, and just to, be mindful, sort of overlap where we can. I like the idea of the, alcohol and cannabis training talking to each other, but not smothering each other. But, I don't know, maybe when there is a fee, you can do, buy one, get the other half price or something.
Thanks, Rose, also for, as a representative representing consumers, actually going out and talking to consumers.
Oh, I mean, I've talked to a lot of consumers, and I'm the coolest people a lot of people I've ever met. Because they're like, oh my God, you're doing this at the state level? Sure.
Yeah, an important part of that role, so I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jiffy before we move on to? See, I put
No,
my back.
no. You put baby in the corner.
It's one of those like bicycle helmet
Yes.
side-
Your Lexi vision.
No, I was just thinking, like, to your point about not adding another cost to licensees, like thinking about if this is another license type, in theory, that's another addition to the tax influx and like the public health and safety fund and things like that. And so I would wonder if there's not a way to make it so that it's not an additional out-of-pocket cost on the licensee, but rather something that is already being covered by the state. And so it's not like, oh gosh, now we gotta pay for this for another new staff because we have turnover, but more so that that's already kind of part of what's happening, that they don't have to like foot that bill consistently.
And if it's based on an individual, I'll just add this, if it's based on an individual's registration, then maybe it's that part of that cost that's already there. Because my recommendation is actually not just for those doing it in the hospitality sector, but any retailer with customer or public facing stuff, as well as their managers, who may not always be publicly facing, but they need to know.
All right, well, thank you, Jiffy, to keep us on track. We will move on, but like with others, reserve the right to send some questions that trickle in from the group.
I'll give my alternative address.
All right, the next topic I'd like to spend maybe 20 or 25 minutes on involves insurance coverage issues. This is a topic that we've spent some time on. The topic has come up organically several times through the first 3 meetings. It's come up again today. We did reach out to some subject matter experts on this. They were unable to make it today, but the superintendent of Maine's Bureau of Insurance is happy to take questions from the group and provide written responses. So This is an opportunity to ask some of those questions, recognizing, at least for the superintendent, that some of these are maybe hypothetical and might be very difficult for him to answer. As all of you know, insurance, while there's big national insurance companies, insurance is regulated at the state level. And since we don't have cannabis hospitality now, some of these ideas will be hypothetical for him. And so some patience and grace with what his answers could be. But I do think that there are some topics that he can provide some insight on. So I've jotted down a few questions that I just want to put out there for the group. But I'd love to hear some additional questions to have sent along to him. I'll probably send these along to him next week. So we give everyone about a week to organize your thoughts around this, send them into Lexi at OCP, and then we can organize them. So one is whether there are national standards or guidance around property, product liability, or other types of insurance when it comes to servicing the cannabis industry generally and cannabis hospitality specifically. So I'm thinking of some of the types of insurance trade organizations and associations that are out there. I know that in some professional organizations, they have just stayed entirely silent when it comes to cannabis. They're afraid of it. They don't want to engage it. They don't want to say the wrong things. I know others have been much more active in this space. I can be honest, I have no idea what it's like in the insurance space around this. So a good question for him. With the use of cannabis or cannabis products on site for a business through consumption lounges in a restaurant setting or at specified events create serious challenges or make cannabis businesses ineligible to access insurance products. With the use of cannabis in conjunction with recreational activities create challenges or bar businesses from having access to insurance products. Would insurance commissions or insurance companies treat the consumption of cannabis in a bar-like setting differently than it would treat consumption of alcohol in a traditional bar-like setting? And so we've talked about these sort of parallel tracks. I think we'll call them Scott 1. Scott 1's presentation today talked about having a pretty extensive cannabis beverage program at the consumption lounges. Would they see this as just a different version of a bar, especially if it is just cannabis and not cannabis plus alcohol, or whether the commission would really think about this in very different ways? And then obviously, what happens when you combine them? Does that create complications from an insurance perspective? As I said from the outset, the last thing I want to do is make recommendations to the legislature that they may take up and ultimately create a policy program that is doomed to fail. And if we make a recommendation for something that no one can possibly get any insurance for, then that is a system that is doomed to fail. And so those are the sort of few questions that I've come up with out of the gate that I'd love to engage on this point with the group. And again, recognizing that there's a week to organize thoughts and send some questions along as well. Yes, please.
In general, two questions I would love to have answered by somebody in the insurance industry. One of which is, are there ways to decrease a premium with a good record, like your car insurance, for example, something like that? And then next one is, why are the rates so high for the different kinds of insurance that are a good idea for like your liability or whatever? Because it seems like price gouging. I mean, if you are a retail store where everything comes in and it's sealed, you literally are essentially a pass-through. Then why are those rates so high? It's not like you are physically manufacturing something. Those rates are high. Or if you're cultivating, same idea. To me, it's almost like if you are getting ready to get married, you put the word wedding in front of anything. Those rates are crazy high. So to me, the cannabis industry kind of seems like that. Oh, you are getting married, you need to go have your hair done. As soon as you say bridal, like triple the cost. So I would love to have answered, I guess, those two questions.
Thank you. David?
They call it the green field.
Right.
Any other questions, comments, feedback?
I would
Sure.
add if, you know, if there would be ways to discount if certain requirements were met.
Is the discount? at
Just,
certain requirements?
yes, like, so if everybody is trained, they require training or, you know.
That's what I meant by
Yeah.
decrease the premium with a
Yeah.
good record, for example, but yeah. Or even if not requirements are met, but if they had suggestions of different ways to decrease it, and you're like, oh, off this checklist of 10 different things, I've met 5 of them.
One of the things I'm going to circle back with Scott about Las Vegas, I didn't want to bring it up initially and sort of direct the whole conversation about insurance, because I wanted to save it for now, was what these types of experiences have been like in Nevada, recognizing that state regulates insurance differently than Maine does, I'm sure in certain ways, but understanding what his clients or partners have experienced it in that way. So we'll get an answer from him as well.
I'll
Yeah, Chris.
put this in an email to you in better words, but I think to kind of expand on one of the points you had with like recreational activities, like are there any red flags that he sees that would be like a, no, this can't be combined with cannabis use, in realizing that this might not be just a lounge somewhere, it might look different.
Yeah, so like red flags or red lines.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Can I ask a question of the group about this? Are the responses to these questions going to impact your support for any of the policies we've discussed? No, I don't want to give an example. I want to ask an open-ended question.
The way that I was kind of viewing this roundtable and online, is not necessarily what I would do or what my business would do, but how I see anyone who is creative in the state of Maine coming into the space and finding a niche that would work for them. So I would say no, it wouldn't impact anything I would come up with, regardless of what any of those answers are, but it's still good to have that information so that we are mindful of everyone in the state of Maine and how it might play out. And hats off for people that can be creative and find their niches.
Scott.
I was just wondering if you might add to your list for the questions. Would it make a difference if state mandates both a Cannabis Liability Act and the seller server training? Will it make a difference to insurance rates versus if they didn't mandate it?
And along those same lines, I guess, because I don't want to give away the answers that any of these insurance experts are going to give you, but are there things that the state can do to reduce the uncertainty? Because I think that's where you're seeing that the green premium is related to the short amount of time these businesses have been out from the cover of darkness. And so it really is just, there's a dearth, well, I wouldn't say just is, but one of the factors is a dearth of data in the same way that there is a lot of data, to Scott's point. So not only are there things that we can do, but is there additional information that the state or other entities can provide to help insurance companies understand the risks associated with these activities?
May I make another suggestion when following up on that? Because there's a ton of money coming into the state as a result of taxed cannabis. And hospitality is going to bring even more. And, so maybe the state starts now with these types of, it doesn't hurt to, educate people about edibles or educate people about cannabis beverages or, but to get the knowledge out there. I liked that somebody, I think it was Scott 2 talked about, he's not all reefer madness, but I think there are a lot of people in the state who still are, I think, pot smokers are crazy and, they have dreadlocks and ride skateboards. I mean, I don't know. I know that I am not, when somebody says, oh yeah, I was a stoner, I'm not who they're thinking of. I don't also call myself a stoner, but somebody else might. That, you know, it's more middle-aged people. Middle-aged people are so happy about the cannabis laws. And, you know, people who grew up smoking pot, and it's against the rules. And love seeing it legal now. I was going somewhere with that. I lost my own point.
The connection to insurance?
I mean, just the connection to insurance is to, you know, cannabis is no different than any other business. You know, I mean, it's different in the way that, you know, soda is different than gas. And that, you know, food is different than real estate. But these things, they're all businesses. They all operate, you know, kind of in their own lane. So when treating cannabis, I think it's really important for the cannabis to be treated in isolation as much as it can be, you know, as a standalone, as part of a wider part of the community. Yeah.
Any other comments, questions, reactions on the insurance fund? All right, before we transition to the next, which will be task force recap and next steps. During the break, Nate, Natasha had asked a question. Natasha, rather than just restating her question, do you want to just ask Nate?
At the last meeting we had, you had mentioned that the requirements or during the most recent legislative process, they changed how many licensed liquor stores could. It used to be based on concentration, or not concentration, but on population sizes, and that had changed, but I haven't seen anywhere what that information is, and you didn't say what they changed it to, so I was just curious.
That is a good question. If you give me 1 minute, I'll pop it in the chat and I'll pull it up for you.
Thank you.
Well, Nate is looking for that. Any additional questions, I guess, on the substantive parts of the task force meeting today? Any outstanding items on that? In the next section, what we'll wrap up with today, I'm going to go through a few, like I said, homework assignments for everyone. Those are on the easier side. I'm going to walk through a little bit of an outline of the types of items we are required to include in the report to the legislature. Lexi has written up a bit of an outline for it. And there are a couple of points I'd like to either verify with the group that I have an understanding of, excuse me, where people are at, or to get some clarity on it. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps after that. Filibustering still, Nate, you still need a minute?
Yeah, I got
Okay.
it.
No worries. Okay, to talk a little bit about some homework assignments. So I talked a bit about getting some questions in. All of these will be really to come in the next week. Questions for the superintendent of the Bureau of Insurance. I'm going to, I feel confident I'll eventually be able to connect Lisa with someone on indoor air quality. So questions you might have about the agency that regulates that in the state. Questions for our calendars with Bablo have just not been lining up. So questions that you might have for Bablo that they could provide some written comments for. I assume these will be written answers. I have been offering everyone the opportunity to just hop on like a Teams or a Zoom call with me, and I'll ask them the questions and we can just tape it. So you might get some video files, you might get some written comments. And then in addition, any other questions outstanding that we can hunt down some external stakeholders for, whether they're inside government or outside government, that over the past 4 meetings have popped up that haven't gotten answered, that pop up after you leave the meeting. We're happy to try to hunt down answers for those. recognizing we probably won't be able to find someone on every topic, but I'm going to do my damnedest to make sure that we get as much information rather as possible from the questions that you have. I see you're off mute, Nate. I'm confident you're there.
I think I've got it, John. I was hoping Anya Trundy was listening and was going to text me the answer, but
I just ran to check and see if I could bail you out. Sorry.
I put in the chat to Alexis the bill or the law now. It made a change so that there was a formula for licensing by population that allows a certain number of agency liquor stores in increments of 10,000 people in a municipality. The bill changed it so that an agency liquor store works, or it would change it to 15,000 or less instead of that 10,000 figure. So it's, when I said percentage, that's what I meant on depending on how many people are in your municipality is dependent upon how many liquor stores that you can have. So they upped that from 10,000 to 15,000.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so as all of you know, this is our last scheduled task force meeting. I just want to take a minute on behalf of myself personally and OCP and the administration for the time and effort, the travel that a lot of you have put in, and the thoughtful responses and questions to the topics, the questions, and the thoughtful, responsive and respectful approach that each of you has taken with each other. There's disagreement in this task force. That's how it's supposed to be. If we were all agreeing with each other on everything, we organized the wrong task force. And so this has been honestly a delight for me. I've really enjoyed the time and the engagement. And I'm confident that we'll be able to put together a good report for the legislature. Before we adjourn, I do want to take a little time to recap the discussions we've had. It's important for the report back to the legislature to reflect accurately all of the perspectives on the task force. And so we make sure we have everyone's input on the record. We need to get some clarity on a few items. So we'll provide some of the we'll put together upfront in the report some of the boring stuff, the background and executive summary, list of members, things like that. But I think the substantive nuts and bolts of it are going to be the task force findings. So one of the topics we are legislatively required to engage is cannabis hospitality business models and license types. I have a pretty good grip on where the group is at. One point of clarity that I'd like some feedback on, whether it's here or whether you send in some feedback. Did those in favor of limiting licenses to adult use businesses mean that the hospitality should be an endorsement on an existing license or a new license type? We can chat about this now if it would help. We can also, I'll say now, we are gonna send around another poll. Some of the questions will be the same as in the previous poll to see if anyone had changed their minds. There will be some additional ones as well, but I wanted to give a moment for some feedback on that point. Whether, I know some of you believe no, licenses shouldn't be limited just to adult use businesses. Some expressed the view that they should be, whether that's just an endorsement, an add-on, or an entirely new license for existing AU businesses.
Coming into this task force, I was under the impression we were only looking at it from an adult use perspective. So I didn't take into consideration anything else because I came in it from that angle, I guess. Also based off of listening, I wasn't here last week, so I just listened to everything that happened this morning. So based off of listening to that, it sounded like there was a lot of discussion that had happened around the endorsement versus a whole new license type based off of your local control aspect. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, I would assume that your your municipalities that have opted in, they've written their ordinances based off of the one of or four parts of the adult use or sections that they have opted in. So with that in mind, their ordinances probably don't support or have the appropriate framework around having this kind of business, whether it all out prohibits it in general, or if they want to modify that in a better way to help support that new kind of business model, I would say. So from what I had gathered from the last meeting, to me, it seems like it would be something that from the towns that have opted in, it would still need to have potentially ordinance changes unless they were so generic that they allowed everything of any kind. I don't remember who it was, if it was Heather, I don't think she's on there anymore. But there was some discussion around that as well. I remember hearing. So to me, that seems like they wouldn't need to opt into it because your default is not opting in, but you would need to decide if that is a section underneath that umbrella you wanted to allow or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I want to make sure I understand the question you're asking, because my interpretation of that, the question you asked wasn't, should we extend hospitality establishments to the medical cannabis program?
Okay.
But the question instead was, there were some folks who were interested in limiting the availability of licenses. And so the question was instead, do we add a new license type that is limited only to those existing program participants? So essentially it's a protectionist policy to protect the folks who are already in the program. Or do we allow just an endorsement on an existing license? Is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And that was directed at the folks who were in favor of limiting the availability of this license. Okay, thank you.
That was just where we had a little lack of clarity in the conversation, the notes we took.
So even if you did an endorsement on it, you would, I assume, would still need your municipalities to modify.
Yeah, there are very few, if any, municipalities that I think sort of threw the barn door open and said, whatever. It's very specific. Very specific to say cultivation, even in cases where everything is allowed, they're listing out cultivation, manufacture, retail, in some cases testing.
And I think the other part of the question comes about because a lot of the states, so it's probably pretty split, but some of the states do retail with an endorsement for cannabis hospitality. So just trying to get clarity if you guys wanted that model or if you wanted like a whole new license type that would be open to existing licensees.
Okay. So adding an authorized activity to an existing license type as opposed to adding a brand new license.
But still keeping your local control.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. Sorry, I didn't understand. So I guess here's I'm trying to like think of how legislators and how people would view it as a whole, and how would they be comfortable receiving this, I guess, because this is going to be, again, uncharted territory. And as much as I don't want to, I was one of the ones in the beginning that didn't want to restrict it. I think Julie and I were both talking about, how can you incorporate other people and other businesses to be able to take advantage of this revenue stream to, the mom and pop restaurant that needs to be open, that type of thing. But would communities and local municipalities be more comfortable with an endorsement on an existing license, like just an add-on with people that they know how they operate already? So like we, for us, to be more apt to, like a town that we operate in that has respect for us is more apt to allow us to add on to our license because they know what we're about.
Almost like a pilot.
Right, exactly. And then maybe expanding that at a later time to open it up, because I wouldn't want to restrict it either. Like that, I think that's quite fair. But I also could see a benefit in kind of pioneering with folks that are in the industry operating and understand the laws now before
You go, woo! Oh my.
Can I add on? So I think that also takes into consideration what John had mentioned at our last meeting as well, which was about taking into consideration the caps or the limits on the number of licenses that a municipality may put in as well. So if you did do an endorsement on those already existing number of licenses that are available, if let's say all were taken, then that doesn't conflict with that. It doesn't open up a complication of, well, then does this count as new licenses within that category that would exceed the cap, or, you know what I mean? No, I got you. Yeah, Yeah. because X town has 5 and they, you know, that's it, that's all they want. And so you're still within their confines, right? Those are the licenses, 'cause it's just an I have an authorized activity. Yeah, that would help.
Well, I think my initial was to give, preference, first refusal, shall we say, to current license holders. Simply because they've been navigating these waters for a really long time and, you know, are maybe now just realizing profits or not yet realizing profits. And I also would like to have an endorsement for Maine owned and operated.
Anyone else? Okay, for you all to sort of think on until the poll goes out, we'll have a poll question about under the category of methods of consumption, also part of the legislative mandate about the availability of edibles in shops. I think we have I think most people were in favor, but if not, we will have that in a poll question. Under the category of non-cannabis products and services being available or made available at a hospitality facility, we'll have a poll question just to verify or clarify people's positions on whether alcohol should be made available or not. And then a question about whether activities or services should be permitted so long as they don't increase liability or break town zoning rules. Whether that should be sort of an open allowance or whether people are in favor of more restrictive rules around that. And then there will also be a question that we haven't quite worded yet, but it does focus on the conversation we just had about questions around local control and opt-in provisions. That's obviously a sticky one, both in terms of getting the recommendation right, but also just because, as we all know, local control is just such a sticky issue in the state of Maine. Cannabis or not cannabis, that doesn't impact local control being a sticky issue. As we just heard from Nate around liquor, these are all ongoing, ever-changing issues in ever-changing areas of policy. I think those are all of the issues, the sort of outstanding questions in the categories that we had. Beyond what was specifically legislatively mandated for us to address, based on the conversations we've had, we've added sections on indoor air quality and ventilation, highway safety, and insurance and liability questions. Obviously, with some of them, information was presented today. For some, information will be forthcoming, and some questions obviously will be circulated to the group as well, based on questions that you have and information that we get. Yes, please.
Follow up from the last one. Also, were you able to get or obtain some clarity on the definition around the conversation of private property versus commercial? I feel like there was a lot of questions around that still that were unanswered.
We engaged a little bit on this in the last meeting about
Right.
the ability to have an event, whether it was public or whether it was private. Lex, we can probably find a timestamp from last meeting and send the timestamp along to Natasha.
Well, no, I watched that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it might have been something we had to follow up with
Right.
the Office of the Attorney General.
It was, I feel like the definition actually was lacking
Okay.
on the differences between when is a business private, because there was a conversation that smoking could happen within inside a private space, and that had to be closed to the public for an hour in order to be considered a private space. So in that consideration, then couldn't you take your public space, like a retail store, close it for an hour, have it by reservation only, and open it up to indoor smoking for everybody? I mean, there's some conflict there. I feel like needs to be expanded on a little bit more. And I don't know if that's more of a definition.
My recollection of the discussion was related to some pretty clearly defined private entities, like veterans organizations
Yeah.
was the one that came.
Gambling.
Yeah, and
you
so
know.
again, those are organizations that are statutorily defined. And so I think when it comes to those particular exceptions to the smoking laws that were being discussed last year, those are pretty, and I can certainly pull this information up in coordination with any attorney who would like to consult with me on it. But I do think that that was different than just saying any business can be private if they shut their doors to the public.
Well, no, and they also use the example of Camp Laughing Grass. Like, well, that was a private property, so.
Right, that was a permitted use within the confine. They were not selling cannabis on site. They were permitting people to use cannabis at
Right.
the campground.
Yeah.
In public,
So is that public or private?
it would be based on the definition of within the smoking statute.
Yeah, we can ask a follow-up question to the Attorney General's office.
I thought it was confusing.
For sure, yeah, no problem. Happy to follow up there. Anything I'm missing, Lexi?
I don't think so. The other things that we plan to cover in the report is just some of the intersection, as we've discussed, and had our ex officios here for the role of other state agencies and statutory conflicts outside of the cannabis statutes that we've talked about a little bit. Not to make specific recommendations on those, but to just call them out for the legislature to consider and to note that we've discussed. We'll probably also add some additional public health and safety considerations that have been brought about by the group. But beyond those things, are there other elements that you guys would like to see added to the report, or topics that we just didn't get to that you think are important to have included? I guess that's kind of an open-ended question that you can also email me in the next week or two. But if you have any thoughts on that now, we'd love to hear those as well.
Process-wise, were you guys still planning on emailing out like a draft?
Yes.
Or something at some point? Okay.
Yeah, probably early November for the draft. And then hopefully we'll set aside a time for us to kind of do a review with the group in mid-November. Thank you.
Natasha's preference was to get the gang back together. So what we will probably end up doing is offering in person as an option, but we will do it hybrid like we're doing here. I think in the last meeting, I had the idea of everyone being remote, but if for technological reasons, you needed to be able to come in, we could do something smaller, but yeah, happy if there's interest to get back together for draft review. That will be a poll question as well, so we get an idea. Maybe it'll just be Natasha and David coming in.
I'll be in too.
But yeah, happy to be as hospitable with the cannabis hospitality. But finally, once again, everyone, thank you for your time. It's been 4 3-hour sessions, so we've spent half a day together. And for almost every one of you, that includes a heck of a drive. It's like a 2-block drive for me from the office, so it's not bad, but it's a lot of time commitment. It's a lot of intellectual commitment as well. I think we're going to be able to put together a really good report for the legislature, hand it off to them, and see what they decide to do. As always, if anything strikes you, please follow up with any one of us, and we will definitely be in touch. And for our remote participants, thank you for hanging in there, everyone, and we will be in touch soon.
I know, right?